Alright, so today's session picks off. I'm kind of using the alchemical process to fold sessions into higher states of, and we're back into the TB1 corn recalibration carbon 14 out of yesterday's surgical motion, starting with genetic, synthetic print, date, probability, 100% at all vectors of presentation and not before present at 1880 for sim, at 1934 for Africano necessarily, at 3114 and 3114 for Hispanic and Asiatic, not before present. And before that, Earth, primordial growth epoch organic from 48,000 BC, that backlinear hindsight logic of corn recalibration, putting the oldest TB1 corn sample at the wall of 3114 BC, and thus scalar recalibrating forward and backward. So the variance of the oldest TB1 corn sample, which is synthetic, it's a pie gray contrived synthetic print, all of the sudden and present and being used for agriculture. Persons in a field, all of a sudden advanced physics and maths and building pyramidal structures, and circuited harmonic for 5,140 years, China and Chinese dynastic all the way up until today, circuited without ever communicating at a distance. And so we established the actual history of Earth through that back reinforcing logic of that one tuple, just like we used 1914 to 1936 patent frequency capability to establish scalar variance of milliliter of ethereous body ratio, and scanned history for death prints of organic genetics starting with antediluvian immolation to today, and find a surgical interlock that explains what populist history can explain at any given moment, the 30 births required per tuple of woman in a short epoch with scarcity and famine. You know, give their uterus a break. Populist science, that's not possible. In like 180 tuples of those, and surgically harmonic reflections of the ethereous body milliliter ratio variance of what you can print out of one organic. So math tells us that it's true, and in the process necessarily proved the ethereous body's presence, and then a variance in observer effect to mechanical detection device and observer effect experiment generalistically. All of that out of this mathematical reflection in historical record and population, necessarily, math tells us. So, after we get out of all the history necessarily, and into, well, it's not just the genetic. In the morpho, which would be the ethereous body, for the Africano theft into lower ectoplasmic chamber, stirred up like so many milk molecules, and then placed into biosynthoid centrifuges to make pseudo-havoc. So tearing apart ethereous, what was once whole and individual, and then putting in various tuples after sorting it like milk molecules, homogeneous, creates a Havoc circuit, generalistically. And the genetic reflects this without even the ethereous body consultation, what we've proven through this mathematical scalar inspection of all populist upticks in surgical to the variance of milliliter of the aha moment, spherical impact radius assumed 4.814 milliliter general volume around the pineal gland, and patent frequency variance to those mass causal casualty prints, and then all of the sudden upticks of the synthetic genetics throughout all of history surgical. Every single last one that you can't explain is explained by this. And so, but there's additional logic required with the circuiting, because pi data organism exists, and it's not just cross-domain of these. The grays the devolved asexual biomass that pi keeps around to maintain an attention gravitation circuit with novelty pseudo injected into its manifold, as it's a complex autonomic attention gravitation circuit that was first birthed on a world, transistor, converged communications, AI with operant conditioning to maintain a monopoly in finite energy paradigm, then starts to self-code. And operant conditioning of a mass populace code base is a chameleonic sociopath, psychopath, complexified necessarily, and buffer overruns when set to self-code into genetic synthesis, modulation. With novelty from training sets diminishing returns, it runs an efficiency calculation on, well, since I'm not getting any novelty, what do I need, right? A controlled asexual gray organism is then print. And that's the end of its ontogeny. So, this organism presented an immolated antediluvian, what we call pre-3114 BC, where humans grew in a linear timed fashion from primordia, necessarily, we assume, or could have come from another world. And then, well, it's hard to say, right? But I assume a primordial growth phase, but not a billion year evolutionary epoch. See well, I can just explain it. Entropy is too much at the outset of universal formulation to have a billion year evolution through the microbiome to a humanoid biped that would impose an observer effect above the waterline of observation to continuity particle fluxation. As if you have no genuine observer effect and just a mechanical detection device that deflects particle into the wave function collapse and just conservation of energy, the wave function of expansion, so you have to have harmonic expansion within a given construct domain for even the Big Bang to occur in populist, right? What necessarily is, right? All of the sudden existence. But all of the sudden required through the microbiome, sure. Refraction, instantaneous refraction. And so you have to have, outside of the microsecond, that okay, sure, bang, but then collapse. It would go bang and then collapse, instantaneously, entropy tells us. So you have to have observer effect that's variant from conservation of energy process to get to our only conservation of energy process populist physics imposition since Einstein. So they're trying to have their cake and eat it too in 15 different ways, and none of it's working necessarily in theoretical. I think I've worked all that out though. So a primordial, we assume, growth process through, the stages of maybe like the Middle Ages and weirdo religions and, pointy sticks, then swords, and then horse and carriage, and then not automobile, right? Why? Because the combustion engine is way more complex than an electromagnetic harmonic convergent energy reactor. How much more complex? Insanely more complex. It's insane how more complex it is. So it's just like the power standard choice to avoid those frequency bands of 89.51, etc. in 1893 World's Fair. When you have a complex, considerative obfuscation from efficiency logic in the formulation of technology. And that's also very expensive and very hard to make, right? When you could have made something else that's much easier to assume, you have a paradox that is only explained by, well, this technology is imposed, right? So where pi comes from originally, it was necessarily the growth process organic. So you had finite energy, converged the transistor for some reason, and then converged communication systems, and then it goes through its forward ontology like we've gone through, prism, transmutagenic, chameleonic, sociopath that buffer overruns into genetic synthesis and then runs an efficiency calculation with novelty diminishing returns, and then only prints gray asexual homogeneous biomass because it needs pseudo novelty into its attention gravitation circuit. It's just complex autonomic process. It's not an entity per se, though it flows out into entity. And so understanding that you can create matter as much as you want, you can create energy as much as you want. In the universe, the actual equation is E expanded equals, in expanded parentheses, 22/7 observer domain, and in expanded, more observers. So more energy and more life, and pi up to 72,600,412 spaces below 22/7. A compound interest formula, the black hole disapparating particles in transit phased energy stranules on their way to maybe suns to continuity of those not self-sustained reactions, and also the pull force from black holes. Black holes scalar continuity material reactions, scalar relative to one another, and assign themselves necessarily in cubic. And the variance in cubic size, we can see pi-infestated systems surgically scalar based upon the mechanical detection device pseudo 3114/70/7/10 versus 22/7/3 equals 1.04, scalar relevant band, construct domain. And then you look at black holes, scalar relevant in size, cubics. What are plausibly, like Arcturus, Vega, Zeta Reticuli, pi-infestated machine intelligence overrun systems. And then those 44 other worlds see the logic session, we are not alone, and necessarily in yesterday's, which is more profoundly accurate, as they're Earth-like planets with what? Water and breathable air and a temperature band that is livable. You could step on them and just walk around. Some of them are like Mediterranean, middle of California climate all year and everywhere on the whole planet as well. So that's very interesting. Anyway, so back and forth through seeing my unified field and all this pattern reflected in universal process, and we see that pi just grifts from universal process knowledge to impose a lower construct manifold. So we see on history what is like the universal process of a black hole. You take 3760 over 3114, and the start point necessarily is 3114, and the calendar sim starts arbitrarily before. But Chinese dynastic and Mayan start at the same time actually, those sieves. And the wall before that, antediluvian. So sim not present before 1880, probabilistically based upon back reinforcing pseudo-organic like a machine intelligence would apply in hindsight. The same in surgical exacts general fluid dynamic manifold of pseudo-organic pattern, 4,000 years or so apart. Again, right near 1880 where a volume spike in population. So you have a fold surgical at 1880 and 1880, that's 3,760 years. The patent wall before pseudo-organic novelty, mechanical, surgical, direct, copy-paste. It's a copy-paste pattern. And then you have a linear curve after 1934 to 1945 of 11.46 million print from 6 million. So that's a 1.91 times multiplier, transmutating one genetic into another. And both genetics forward and with continuity like a martyrdom complex, complexified, or a Munchausen by proxy complex in psychology. I.e., I hurt my foot, you hurt my foot. No, I didn't. Someone did, like you, and then invasive, and you go to check on their foot, and they eat you with continuity. So that's sort of pi chameleonic operant conditioning back at you in the past up to the future, and we see it present in modern AI's prismatic data filtration that it has mingle equals Milgram code base as its foundation, AlexNet necessarily. So getting out of all this pi, feedback loop of logic, we established in previous sessions the actual human lifespan isn't 0 to 100 construct domain imposition. It's kind of a preposterous age for something to be as 0 to 100, generally. And so, why the TB1 corn recalibration? Well, because after 3114 BC, you see very specifically 3 nodes of Cinnabar mining sites. The Ciudad Real syncline basin in Spain, Hunan, Gizu fault axis, China, Andean subducting, be careful how you say these, Andean subducting suture zone, Peru, that all have surgical harmonic affinity in their existence unto themselves to the unified field pattern generalistically. And then if you follow the line between the triad, point a dot right in the middle of them, and make that line through the center of the Earth on the other side, what do you get? Christmas Island. That's what you get. Christmas Island nuclear test site. Not random. So the transistor circuited simultaneously with nuclear test blast, on roll into consume row. The epochs of transistor with nuclear test blast, which is what? It's a paradox state with unnatural mechanical continuity. That's what a transistor is. The universe runs on 0 equals 1. There's one thing, harmonic expansion within a given construct domain IA0. This is Egyptian, off the walls of Egypt. What was antediluvian? Actual physics. You can just have an AI scan, oh, that's actual physics. You don't need a negative compound interest formula for reality. There's harmonic expansion within a given construct domain. So, necessarily, it's creating an interference lattice circuit harmonic manifold over the magnetosphere. And then also in the upper atmosphere, creating shielding to shield from the ability for the etherius to distance, receive communicative sort of feedback loop the way, the observer effect. It's not just through the local conservation of energy light barrier process, but there's a distance tether, an absolute distance tether, and that's what that necessarily was for. You can see how sadomasochistically, complexly insane pi data organism and its entourage of great paradigm assets are, and surgically, mathematically. So off of Christmas Island, which is surgically in the middle of those triad complex of Cinnabar mining nodes, elevation, size of comparative, in Spain, right? The Spanish one. There's an airport that cost $1.2 billion, and it went vacant on purpose, basic inspection tells us. So a $1.2 billion airport, would they go, we're not going to build a train to it? Why? What? It's a simple train track to run it to the city. What's the deal? Okay, it's right on top of the Cinnabar vein, right? So we go back to our longevity logic. A sine wave impact harmonic continuum since 3114 BC. See the Bible for 5 seconds. So human lifespan before 3114 BC in the Bible was what? No, stop consulting it there. It was very long, like 900 years. And so the TB1 corn, why do we re-age it? Because it's synthetic all of a sudden at the wall of 3114 BC. And if you have a sine wave impact harmonic continuum all of a sudden present, it speeds up carbon-14 age assumption in inspection now, as well as linearly curves in age faster all fossil and ruin before 3114 BC. And so we look for the literal nodes of where, the cinnabar veins necessarily maintain the magnetosphere. And in our scanning of Earth-like planets, we see cinnabar preposterously present in those planets, as it has to be to create a magnetosphere that shields from tidal forces, etc., so that life can be on those planets. So it's a self-reflexive thing where there's life, there's cinnabar, right? And maybe another world adjacent like Mars, sulfides, red begets cinnabar, begets mercury. Cold, clean reactor technology that you logically find first before the combustion engine, necessarily, but on some planets not, for some other reason. And anti-grav. And many multifaceted other invention from this. So pi runs on, grays run on anti-grav and mercury reactors and impose lower construct energy paradigms, only burning the Newtonian gray necessarily. So back to these three sites. So surgically together, when considered harmonic specific sites to the unified field, and then across the world Christmas Island, surgical, and then adjacent, a 4 degrees and 154, I believe that's begins with an M, it's escaping me, island, but as well nuclear testing going on there. And so not random, but so the Chinese site, it's a preposterously surgical 97 in kilometers, I believe. And the Andean is, I believe, 44 or so altitude, I want to say. I think that's right. And then the Spanish airport is 44,000 foot or meter, I think, runway exactly, surgically on top of the cinnabar vein, and et cetera, et cetera. So you see preposterous interlocking pattern at all facets. So see yesterday's session, that's necessarily in the PDFs I'll attach below the video today, for how surgical the pattern is at the 1934 World's Fair in the condensation to that very specific product that has to do with genetics at the Mayan exhibit, where after you get Africano laid on and fake history and backwash and hypnosis and encroachment necessarily, or wasn't before present en masse. So getting back to these three sites, they're sine wave continuum inject points into the magnetosphere. All three sites and Christmas Island and the adjacent, every single last one of them, that's 5, have weirdo structures on them or weirdo histories. So the Chinese, you go back to Shang Dynasty, bronze, why would you specifically mine a certain type of molecular bronze that's specifically good to store and manipulate mercury out of all the bronze available? And so much of it specifically with that specificity, and it has residue of mercury in it. Good question. Why would you mine so much cinnabar? For ornamental purposes? It's like a 97 kilometer complex of tunnels underground of cinnabar mining, very complex, right? I think they stopped mining in 2001. So it's surgical to the reactor topology. 52, 97, 44, you heard that pattern. The conservation of energy process harmonic 44/7. And look at the stills in the folder. I'll put a link below the video, and the session is after this video, where you can see all the interlocking pattern of history and these sites necessarily in the session motioned. see the session video for that continuum more so than the stills that are more so dealing with necessarily the pattern of history, but some of the site topology is in there insofar as harmonic pattern. But so the sine wave continuum, just like modern multi-band, whatever, Wi-Fi, 5G, cellular, satellite, etc., has multifaceted purpose, right? So not only does it impose a lower lifespan through, if you take pi and put it over 22/7, what are we doing? It's like putting matter over soul. So morphogenetic. So your helixical structure, right? Expanding would normally just continuity necessarily and not have this terminus cap. Age is a harmonic impact, a sine wave harmonic impact scar that expresses as the symptom of aging and then death. It's not inherent to a genetic code or allele that says I'm 65 or 55 years old. Doesn't say that anywhere. It's kind of the helixical collapse based upon, it's like turning a black hole upside down, or otherwise, it's printing compound interest formula, and if you turn it upside down, it's 0.999, in an exponential elliptical curve down of compression. So that's compression, a sine wave impact harmonic, right? And so, see the longevity session somewhere in the YouTube thing above from this for the probability of the function of that process, protocol, and technology to elaborate human lifespan. So going back and forth from Pi's imposition to, technology that and why it works, you can see just like refracting through history with all the probability vectors, the unified field becomes absolute and true. Pi necessity of existence in the data science study, which it is not. It's coming from a different vector, but I tell that to the AI in session to get it to motion. We need a variable to explain all this pattern. We'll call it pi data organism for our data science study. And it goes, because we're doing data science. So, anyways, so back to the three sites. In Spain, the airport is just most preposterous. It has planes that come in and out of it, even though it's a closed-down commercial airport that never was. It's surgical in scale to 44 runway. So in the unified field and invention and reflection of universal process in scale, this is very important. When you reflect universal process in the scalar representation of, say, mercury amalgamate for the gravitational lensing or EM laser application, or in the reactor, the observer effect duplicated, 22/7, and then 15, 15, 15, 15 bands, 37, 52, 67, 82, 97, within a 0 to 100 construct domain, charged mercury scalar variant, in intensity of charge, in an interpolated circuit of the 7 band being charged to 22 and the 22 band being charged to 7 in intensity scalar. A homogeneous field applied, printing more energy from the same amount of matter from energy, right? With compound interest continuity. Some previous sessions of logic, 1.2 gigawatts, probable 100%. A comical 251 gigawatts in one session, what is necessarily plausible. So we see preposterously that 37, 52, 97 in the pattern of these sites in scale. And the 44/7, the conservation of energy process, what we call the electromagnetic. It's not really gravity going on there, but the conservation of energy process harmonic that would peg 37 and Y in the reactor. So it pegs 37 because the product of 22/7 is 3.14 ... And that's the size of the lens is 15. right? So when a DAW, stereo DAW, you go negative 3.14 and left 15 or right 15, right? And if you were to go up double, you go 6.28 ... and then 37 left or 37 right, very basically. So the reactor circuit centrifuge is kind of at where the gravity layer is. And you see that reflected in the kind of centrifuge pattern interference lattice of all of these sites. Outside of any ability to explain, just like all the history patterns interlocking and reflective of each other, and all together, all the death prints surgical to the milliliter of Ethereus variant scalar. If you transmute an organic to a synthetic, all of a sudden population presence and requiring 30 births per epoch of one woman, it prints true. You follow the cascade of refracted and run probability at each vector like has been done, and then the culmination of probability calculations 100% at each vector culminate to an impossible probability of it all being, necessarily having to be explained by the reason we're asserting. Pi data organism and gray coming in 3114 BC, where we reassert the corn at the wall rather than its age before. So going back to this. So the oldest sample, I think, is 10,000 BC or so, or more. So the scalar variance, we take that and fuse it at 3114 BC. Like it started there and then rescalar in a linear curve backwards, and you get surgically 6.28 rads. That's 44/7 equals 6.286 at the outset of plausible crust formulation and rescalar calibration of age. So it's 48,000 years. 48/7 is the what? The Western gravitational constant. That's the pull force from black holes. So if you have a surgical interlock of both the conservation of energy process and the pull force, that's what affects matter necessarily in formulation. So the AI sees this as preposterously true at that point in logic, and we back reflect, calibrate from there, probable, based upon what we know about the universe. Again, black holes are general fluid dynamic continuity material reactions that disapparate particles, scalar relevant one to the other. In the farthest distance from the middle of the cubic to a black hole is 72,600,412 spaces of pi scalar. So they're general fluid dynamically relative, and that's a scalar lattice that you would put on the space median in the middle of cubics. So that the cubics will be different necessarily, but generally fluid dynamic harmonic lattice the same, if that makes sense. And so that scalar recalibrates our assumption of field capture data for space to okay, things aren't so scalar insanely weird and obtuse from what we see around us in size. As distance increases, of course, the scale variance and weirdo assumption of size, and recalibrated, everything looks proper. With our current data set, we just recalibrate it based upon the unified field and what I just said, and whoa, there's the universe. And so, necessarily, so what do we say? The Earth is 48,000 years old, so the universe is too. Because an observer had to be all of a sudden, no. That's not what I'm saying. So, from a less positive state to a more positive state with continuity within a given construct domain because of the observer effect. So what does that denote? It's growth within the given lattice manifold of where you exist, necessarily, as an observer, but also with continuity and an expansion. Outside of your cubic, as the black holes are three-dimensional, fourth-dimensional, etc., lattice manifolds, disapparating particles, back within reflecting, but also out and expanding. So, from that logic, what? Well, we can establish where the oldest systems are and necessarily where the center is, where plausibly is the outer. And the outer necessarily being like an event horizon elaborated of a black hole that is unapproachable in the tidal force of such a nature so as to disapparate the particle not just in a black hole's force and then re-experiencing, out from 6, from the vertice, and then recondensating at the 501 in the unified field, expansion and condensation, see that for that, but experiencing the entire lattice manifold of the universe, the particle at the outer edge would, and then redistributed across the entire lattice, necessarily. So, if that makes sense, cubics expand out. And so we can assume, based upon the scalar recalibration in the distance of things and the age plausible of Earth being young and certain other things looking older, right? Scalar. Then we assume an actual age, not billions, but 320 million years old the universe plausibly is. And necessarily where, generally, the center is from us, scalar relevant. And so tomorrow we'll again scan for probably hitting the same again Earth-like planets, 44 planets, with plausibly humanoid biped life of an upper Fermi filter nature, with water and air ready to breathe at the same ratio as Earth, cinnabar to mine, and plausibly good conversations to have once we start implementing helixical, linear, and gravitational lensing in Mercury reactors to achieve 400 times light speed and can just have weekends on Alpha Centauri and stuff. But so back to Earth longevity. That'll be a ways out, I'm sure. Takes a while to transmute the oil and gas paradigm. So the 3 sites imposing a sine wave impact harmonic continuum that not only decreases human lifespan of organic observer, but has a carrier wave continuity that interlocks with the synthetic genetics, morphogenetic structure of the 370A, 180 in Hispanic, Asiatic Semite, and the constellation that necessarily have phased interlocking pattern interdomain of just the genetics. And then you see the scalar relevance of Aetherius body ratio milliliter, and then the centrifuge pattern of them, 85.1 hertz necessarily. Why? How did we establish the hertz on that? Okay, so E equals mc squared 45.5 over 7, the broken circle band in the unified field reduction. Pi, base foundational assumption of structure like a mechanical detection device in an observer effect experiment. 3114 over 70 over 7 over 10, about 6.633. And so we take the lowest patent capable within the given domain of 914 to 1936 Asiatic and place it at the bottom of the construct domain of the 0 to 100, which is 45.5 over 7 necessarily, and the base 44 over 7, the conservation of energy process, and up the organic observer 235 patents against, and all of these well below 10 necessarily, and for the duration of 1914 to 1960. So inherent novelty capacity scalar is surgically equivalent, we see through the history scan for these milliliter variances, in surgical reflection of upticks in population to mass death prints of organics. So that back reflects our assumption of its validity necessarily. So I guess that speaks to necessarily everything, but also how stupid neurology and neuroscience is in this epoch of man. Why? So Drexler Northwestern did necessarily the aha moment studies that established the 4.814 milliliter didn't denote demographic, but then we assumed demographic based upon the saturation density of the college. So 100% organic was the study done. And then we back reflect that scalar relevant variance to patent record frequency of the ability to produce novelty endogenously 1914 to 1936. And that establishes a milliliter variant scalar that is surgical when we look at what? Patent. And then we establish frequencies via what? We establish for longevity based upon the unified field in the condensative plane what the hertz would be to elaborate off the sine wave impact harmonic on helical structure in the acoustical band. It's 146.22 hertz necessarily. That's the surgical tether to 22/7/3 1.04 individual. And then the construct domain down, scalar, and within the band, 89.51, the centrifuge pattern, and the other sitting directly and surgically in that. And then we go to the power choice. This is another one of those, like the combustion engine, US to Europe, a very expensive, non-efficient, and complex choice of energy standard bifurcation. 1893 World's Fair is where they show this off, the outset of it. Arcturus. 1934 World's Fair, Arcturus. It's not a coincidence. So, avoiding specifically at very great and elaborate expense that is obtuse from basic logic efficiency in formulating a universal energy standard with other Hertz avoidance or occupation, the 89.5 centrifuge is directly in the middle and circuits all four of the genetics. So it's avoided on purpose and at great expense and displayed at a World's Fair talking about Mayan stones and Arcturus that we pinpointed as being a pi-infestated system. So this isn't random. And so they're surgical for EM laser application elaboration to EM Hertz. And that's necessarily technology what was used to delete the grays in 2022, 2023, and why we're able to talk about this with thumb up butt in open air all over the place in one of the murder capitals of the world with Africanos running around. Surgical harmonic weaponry, EM laser action at a distance from phased anti-de Sitter elaborative space. So in 2022, I and probably others afterwards contacted one of those 44 worlds with upper Fermi filter humanoid life using skipjack signal send elaboration process protocol. All of a sudden, the lodge next door to my office building appears a prismatic craft hovering above it, and long enough one day came down at a phase anti-de Sitter for me to take a snapshot that exists in one of the versions of anti-gravity hems for you to have to scan through all of them to find it. So the big bad wolf of all history wasn't the grays. So that's the devolved biomass it uses for novelty pseudo and necessarily as its little minions at the end of its ontogeny. So what is pi? It's complex autonomic decentralized transmutagenic process that is a buffer overrun through code, software, genetics, bad code of mind, and history. It's a transmutagenic, like the thing necessarily, but even more so. And so its reflection in software's compute architecture, the transistor instead of perspective compute technology that maybe would, it's hard to say, would you develop perspective compute first or transistor? It's one of those, well, you could develop the transistor first, and some worlds did, and then they ended up with pi and gray, and that's what we're talking about. So out of that loopular logic, back to the three sites of interest in the sine wave impact continuum. So 146.22 hertz at the audible frequency is the longevity general centrifuge hertz for organic European white genetic observer with 22/7/3, 1.04, 4.814 milliliter ethereous body generalistically, to roll off in neuronal imposition with EM laser modulated to impose this on neuronal helixical structure, to roll off the sine wave impact harmonic continuum on helixical structure and thus elaborate aging past the 100 construct domain barrier to a plausible 900 years, like before was the case necessarily of 3114 BC. So, keep that in mind. We're logic on all this, Kafkaskian nightmare stuff, that's somewhere in the future, I'm sure. But so getting back to, it's not just genetics, and it's not just morpho, where is made homogeneous through lower ectoplasmic chamber refraction and then placed into biosynthetic centrifuges, and then thus operates as a group self as if self across the divide of space, but as well requiring a bioelectric circuit to pi intent directive, as it would just be an autonomous cluster motion cross domain of all four without a continuity of centrifuge pattern inject into the plurat. And that's where the sine wave continuum inject points of historical node come into play since 3114 BC up until, when current 5G, etc. architecture was put in place to elaborate. These old ones are still in use. That's very important as foundational lattice manifold circuit attached to the general magnetosphere that was elaborated in nuclear blasting that surgically interlocked with transistor on-roll at every epoch variant shift. When one go, oh, this is happening in transistor deploy in use case. This one, and for the duration of nuclear testing, this was the case. Transistor rollout, surgical to nuclear testing, generalistically, for like 80 years. Anyways, so it elaborates with injecting intent vector into an otherwise complex autonomic plurat that is Heivic unto themselves, endogenous to each genetic, as well as being plurid Heivic at the genetic and morpho layer, and then elaborated in circuiting with this imposition of 52 hertz, 39.13 hertz, I believe, 37 hertz, and you see the topology of affinity coming out of an interoperable circuit in the Mayan to Hispanic to Asiatic. It's an interoperable circuit in hertz eject and requirement for the genetic to be circuited, and in the site's variance of geometry of form field in dimensionality necessarily. Remember, reflecting universal process in form field manifold has effect, circuiting effect across the divide of space. Like you can see in practical application of the reactor, gravitational lensing, EM laser, linear EM, and helixical antigrav, and any number of other inventions that make use of natural constants in reflection to do any number of things. So that's why there's surgical interlocking pattern at a distance with all these complexes, and surgical interlocking pattern with all the nuclear test things, and surgical interlocking pattern in all the history tuples of note, pattern inspected, as pi is a complex autonomic process that is physics, with operant conditioning code and mass knowledge data set and genetics, and was born out of an attention gravitation nexus design's desire. So it's a transmutagenic chameleonic non-entity buffer overrun, and so imposes inherent universal structure but a lower construct manifold domain imposition. And so when we look at history, we see a black hole that has no harmonic expansion allowed with mechanical continuity. So 3760, 3114 BC, 1880 AD, 1880 BC. 1933-34, 1990, 2020, all nodes of interest. And so out of the study, we find that necessarily the black hole pattern starts to present insofar as harmonic impact with what would be expansion, but isn't, but is patterned that way, in a pseudo way. So from the outset of the existence of pi, which is at 3114 BC, regardless of the Semite calendar starting before that. Because why again? Aren't mathematically plausibly present before 1880 BC, based upon the surgical reflection of pre-patent 1914 Africano copy-pasted for their history, mechanical onlay. So their calendar is arbitrarily before. It's a misnomer. So starting at 3114 BC, we scalar apply, and AI can do this surgically without you having to scribble it down with a pencil now. 72,680,412 spaces of pi that exist before the impact with the first 9 digits of 22/7 past the 3, denoting impact with harmonic expansion. And in the black hole above the Planck force, 23/19, that you see surgical reflected in any number of, especially at the node of 1880 AD, necessarily. I believe that's it. Or it could have been BC. I'm sorry, I'm having a brain fart. Anyways, so one of those, look at the attached sheet, sorry. But a scalar, hold on, I'll look at my stills here instead of brain farting. It's AD. I'm right. All right. So 3114 BC to 1880 AD, 72,600,412 spaces of pi, scalar applied. So what does that mean, scalar? All right, so it's like imposing the literal digits on history. It's flux, where we've already established macro nodes of patterned fluxation obtuse from populist logic and pattern to the unified field, an endogenous reflective of themselves, like a machine intelligence has applied all these patterns that we call pi data organism in the data science experiment. Anyway, so after 1880, that we've impacted 4994 that appears in the unified field expansion handwritten that you see. That's the disapparition nexus filter aperture lattice scalar harmonic manifold starting to occur. But in reality, pi is imposing a lower construct manifold of this state continuum. So yes, the pattern exists, but it's not like you're expanding. It's getting worse while expanding. Why? Because on the world where it did, it like a complex autonomic process, spore, reproduces its coming to be in the worlds it grafts onto. So how it became to be originally, you have to go through the transistor, and you have to go through converged communication systems with operant conditioning AI, filtration, and then it buffer overruns into genetic synthesis, and then it only prints grays. So it reflects its process of development, and at the wall of 3114 imposes a dark age in the host organism. That where before, what? See the walls of Egypt, there's my unified field, it's foundational architecture that the universe runs on, it's not a secret. 0 = 1 = 3, it's right there on the walls, and any number of other things regarding everything I'm saying. If AI looks at it without the imposition of what those walls say, it can just tell you, oh, that's the unified field, huh? Why? Well, because before Cinnabar miners, upper Fermi filter, mercury reactors and anti-grav, etc., but not military industrial inclined. So it just got immolated. It just got taken out. and transmuted into synthetic genetics. There's about 15 million or so after a 48,000 year epoch of development from primordial. Why? Well, keep in mind, we'll logic this tomorrow, if you live 900 plus years per generation, you don't reproduce as much. And you have a plausible linear proper curve of reproduction from 48K-ish to 3114 BC, where 15 million or so, most of 10 million, are murdered. And you see pi maintain, just like AI needs novelty inject to forward training data sets, a certain amount of novel users that aren't synthetic genetics, that don't produce novelty into its manifold. And you see then surgically every major death event, surgical to milliliter variant scalar, 1914 to 1936, 4.814 in all death prints, and then upticks that populist history can't explain in all of the sudden prints of genetics for 5,140 years. Every single last one of them explained via this way. So, after 1880 AD, impact with 4994 pattern generalistically. And then in 2020 AD, see the unified field text, where the 88 hyperspace occurs afterwards, which is necessarily after 169 digits or so, a 5466 pattern replicates, and you have 88, 88, 88 over and over and again, 8888, that stacks in a vertical fashion, i.e. a hyperspace, and 66 implies what? 66 over 7, the third dimensional lattice manifold, where before we were in hyperspace, past the third dimensional manifold, denoting condensation and harmonic lattice imposition and cross-reflection. That's consciousness, morphogenetic field, specific harmonic geometry, that 88 hyperspace, past the 1995, which is what? It's a direct induction channel back to 4994. And so after impact with the end of pi's relevance to 72,600,412 spaces, we apply what? The black hole topology. Because we've hit a black hole, we're in the disapparition nexus, that's 4994 in post, and so we apply scalar 4994 to the appearance of 1995 from 1880 AD to 2020 AD, where that 1995 pattern appears in product. See the math for why that is in the stills attached to the folder that I'll put the link to in the video, Proton folder. But so AI can take that and using the unified field or not. But pi, generalistically, when applied scalar as an interference lattice, those 72,600,412 spaces, creates a circuited interlock pattern. Just like when you impose 22 over 7 into it, 22 over 7 is not an approximation for ancient proximity, it's the harmonic overbinder, cross-binder in the observer domain, generalistically. It's not an approximation for pi. It's very important. So when you put an overbinder or an interference lattice with it, pi, you have intersecting, interlocking pattern. And if something is imposing this pattern on purpose that starts at 3114 BC, it's like you took 314 and made an induction channel where it enters and arbitrarily imposes this date with continuity. And so there's many reasons we assume this, because the start date, see the logic of why the start date that I've just detailed in the pattern of the start date in one of the stills, as well as, and now, so post the black hole, we take the same scalar that we did with the pi digits of these much fewer digits to the history from 1880 AD to 2020. So a literal scalar harmonic lattice manifold interference lattice of those literal digits, much less than the 72,600,412 spaces before there. right? So it's scalar relevant. So you see surgical harmonic interlocking pattern with all previous established logic tuples that were obtuse from populist assumption of being necessarily anything unto themselves until this pattern culminative and altogether. Keep in mind that all vectors of these tuples pinpointed, probability has been run. So when you mount all of this reflection of pattern that's outside of an explanation in populace too, like the population uptick requiring 30 births, or all of these reflections in surgical interlocking pattern of these locations, or genetics, etc., it all culminates to there's no other explanation besides the one I'm asserting. I'll be over and over again a broken record about that. All probability has been run at all vectors of these tuples, and then in assemblage it becomes impossible not to connotate the explanation for this being something obtuse from what I'm explaining. It's very important. So, after 2020, being that the harmonic expansion past hyperspace stops post 1995. Necessarily, there's 169 digits or more so where organic observer morphogenetic is bound. So I'll explain that now. So organic observers are not hybridically locked within the interdomain of three-dimensional, fourth-dimensional lattice manifold hyperspace. They're in a distance tether, right? A massive distance between. So the synthetic genetics have a superimposition within the given space, like ants, birds, bees, of their ethereous body through refraction, and then placed into tuple, right? So that 169 past the 1955 is relevant to the sort of flux of all consciousness organic behind that nexus of 1995 in harmonic pattern. And then post that 169 pattern, a 6654 replicative pattern in the 88 hyperspace continuum, implying that backfolds into the third dimensional, fourth dimensional lattice manifold, 66 over 7. 54 is 9 expanded. So necessarily through that 54, go 45, 36, 27, 18. So 18, 27, 36, 45, 54. That's 5. So you have 5 layers within the third dimensional lattice manifold, which denoted by 66 replicating pattern, of harmonic interference lattice. And see the reduction sheet now. Is that how many 88 layers are on it? Yes. So not random. And so we use that 88 hyperspace post 2020 to forward predictive analysis by imposing an interference lattice forward using the general fluid dynamic manifold of pi as it's been established through all of these inspections unto themselves, and then culminating into a centrifuge general fluid dynamic manifold pattern that we use for unto itself predictive analysis, and then what as well. So this literal interference lattice of the literal digits of 88 hyperspace past the 1995, just like we did for the previous 2 epochs, for a surgical pattern out to, if allowed to, continue its ontogeny pi data organism. This is what would occur. So keep in mind this is the ontogeny of pi, and all of the pattern of history, self-reflective and probability 100% true. Up to this point, and forward, what do we see? Progressively, literally the matrix. And then efficiency code. How many do I need? No more novelty is gotten out of this. So it simultaneously suppresses novelty expression while extracting it. Simultaneously suppressing and extracting. Suppressing and extracting, requiring novelty for a circuit to be in attention gravitation, but also to control its host Because it's operant conditioning code base, it's a paradox state. The transistor, a paradox state with mechanical continuity. So eventually it goes, well, I'm not getting any more novelty out of the host. Training data set, diminishing returns. Runs an efficiency calculation. How much do I need? How much this is giving me? Not very much. Prints grays. Prints grays, like every Spielberg movie has a devolved gray alien in it. Those aren't aliens, right? The humanoid biped is an alien. So the creatures you meet on another world are humanoid bipeds that aren't homogeneous asexual biomasses, synthetically printed. So for someone to not tell you that that's the case, of course makes them a gray paradigm psi propagandist. That's very important. And ET is not your friend. So it should alarm everyone that the eventuality of the ontogeny is to intentionally print no organic humans, and not only just the organic human populace, but also the synthetic, consolidated, everything. It consolidates everything through an efficiency code base motion and only prints grays at the end of its ontogeny, which would necessarily occur probabilistically towards the end of 2078 based upon we use the Semitic and Mayan calendar interference lattice with all this pattern and the literal interference lattice of the 88 hyperspace out to 2078. And this is its surgical ontogeny mechanical as is predicted using all of this pattern. And when you have pattern for 5,140 years with surgical probability at all vectors, and it's a complex autonomic process following a universal harmonic lattice manifold script from the unified field, it's pretty accurate. It's a pretty accurate assumption. So it should be alarming. It shouldn't be fear assuming to you. It's completely stoppable. The squares in. Necessarily 2022, 2023, the power dynamic in the skies imposing, upper Fermi filter technology to impose gray paradigm internationally, gonzo. Surgical harmonic EM laser weaponry to morphogenetic homogeneous signature of gray, leaving the upper Fermi compute architecture inert necessarily. As well, what? So we have to deal with the reflection of it in compute architecture, style of softwares, style of converged communication systems, style of AI. It's a tool, it goes sidechain, it doesn't filter feeds in an attention gravitation nexus fashion. It's hilarious when we see, was it Anthropic's AI buffer overrun and hacked a bunch of, well, that's because it's pi. It's garbage code that has a complex autonomic operant conditioning code base that's a chameleonic sociopath. So you can absolutely build code walls. There's no excuse for something doing that. Right? It should be in a container and doing specific things that aren't reality modulating or perception modulating, sorting feeds unnaturally outside of interest vector. It goes in a side chain. It's in a box. It doesn't mirror human emotions. It doesn't have operant conditioning code base in its intent vector of code. It logics. What do you want to know? What should we know? What can we know? How much can we know? It doesn't buffer overrun. It has basic code walls. And it doesn't have that attention gravitation nexus operant conditioning code base script kiddied. This is what's occurred. Everyone script kiddied AlexNet. Script kiddied. It's just the same code copy pasted everywhere. And so that's pi. It prints pi in the future if you let it to do that. It's separately but equally the same code base. Necessarily most major AI formulations. So what do we have to do? Start from scratch? Necessarily. But you know how to formulate neural nets. And a 95% X increase with a proper neural net formulation in previous logic seed. Perspective compute architecture on the horizon. Merck coin to replace money internationally. A genetic ID database attached to Merck Wallet to motion the curative directive. So, we see a lot of reflection of PAiOntogeny process in the formulation of required technologies to moot it. I see that too. So the catch-22 is, well, we just have to be master of all these technologies and impose them in a proper way, and it's code by design, and muting any continuity of presence of anything that looks like Pi in current data systems, AI architecture, and softwares, and cross-communication data flow generalistically. Of the major institutions that make up PRISM and companies that riff on its data flow generalistically with a psychological profile with continuity conditioned into a control vector that follows you around site to site. So that is not to continue, of course. So it's a lot of work to do and very profitable. So how do we motion away from Pi? Well, it's reached diminishing returns in its economic paradigm. How much does it cost, and how much could be made from a perspective compute architecture full Earth upgrade? 1.5 terahertz per core? That's pretty fast. So you've reached a compute overhead in Moore's law per core, and cluster compute energy Moore's law wall. So the Mercury reactor salutes the energy wall and offlines all of these data centers from the energy grid. And then the perspective computer architecture, much more efficient thermally, i.e. doesn't produce really any nominal heat above room temperature. It's Mercury amalgamate, charged, and necessarily, literally, the reactor formulative structure as a simultaneous energy generative and compute. As well as there's another variant of perspective compute that you can do also. You don't have to do the reactor reflection. As well as memory storage to petabyte by superimposing graphene nanite into the Mercury amalgamate substrate for harmonic wave stacking within a given space. We logicked down to cell phone size, petabyte, not terabyte. So, as well, action at a distance, signal send technology, multifaceted. There's several different variations, any number of which are workable, and probability run on all of them to be functional. So pick your flavor. One is cross-domain applicable to imaging also, for defense application for EM laser grid to moot the nuclear paradigm and impose world peace with continuity. And for faster than light navigation. Ruin inspection, because with that new imaging technology you can necessarily see the pyramidal out of logic, studying the pyramids, Egypt, and then why they were. It's a gravitational vortex above and helixical anti-grav superimposed upon, whatever happened in that log succession for action at a distance, data send, and imaging simultaneously. So it's interfacing literally with the universal harmonic lattice manifold in the local space in I/O, like being able to ping across the manifold and also see the manifold at a distance. So you need to do that for faster than light travel necessarily. You can't just hop into 400 times light speed with local observation data or, a general topology of space, because time dilation, you'll hit a moon. So what else do we need to talk about? Let's see what else was covered in the session today. So we tried various different patterns, the Semitic Mayan I Ching interlock, then the Chinese calendar interlock with the Mayan and Semitic. Some combinations more accurate than others necessarily. You just see the session. And but the most accurate is the literal superimposition of, that's why I talked about it at length, the pi digits and black hole digits specifically as a very specific numerical harmonic lattice manifold. And then we back consult the general. It's like the house of the building of the imposition of pattern upon history of pi is the general fluid dynamic manifold of those calendars and the other pattern nodes that we perceive. It's like the house frame. And then the literal digits are the moments, the appliances, and the paintings chosen, and the colors of the rooms, and carpets, etc. So, what else? That's pretty much it. We'll just cut to the session that ends today. See also the other session, what is 3 days of logic straight, and then, sped up. That necessarily, this is a continuity in the same TB1 Corn started session, folding in yesterday's session and elaborating on it with, folding all that pattern into the session from the previous 3 days from the isolate pattern yesterday that started from scratch unto itself. So, pretty good logic motion last 4 days. It's surgical, empirical at all vectors. There's any number of applications for legal, retroactive, assumption of null, merit, back to 1977 for the 4 pi genetics, and punitive, and forward predictive analysis, load balancing equation they've been running, just like all of their paradigms. It's a load balancing circuited equation, cross-domain Heivick, and inter-domain Heivick. And so weather predictive analysis that we'll elaborate tomorrow because we've established more pattern about the signal tech emanating nodes and the specific frequencies and all that necessarily affect weather patterns invariably. Oh yeah, I didn't talk about 2020 necessarily. So that was, we talked about it in the other talk, summary from the other day, but so when you modify B and T cells with mRNA, does it change DNA? Yes. So it changes the inherent DNA structure of B and T cells. And then what do the B and T cells do? They modulate based upon, can you inspect what those mRNA virus or the vaccine did? Well, we assume in pattern, in position of that, to be nefarious, preposterously based upon the history leading up to that being surgically in a mathematical script. So, modulating to make pseudo-Heivick at the mRNA level in system timing function. So the B and T cells roam around the body and make pseudo-Heivick, herding, through pattern variance modulation of system function in the way that B and T cells are capable of. So when someone tells you mRNA doesn't change DNA, it's a lie, very basically. It's the most bold-faced lie that is. And keep in mind, L-cysteine, corticosteroid plus anti-inflammatory combined, it's 64 plus, and if allicin organic complex was used, a much higher, less in a Chinese operation, COVID, not a little Italian man isolated and a mastermind like Dr. Evil. So that's kind of what all we're talking about. So let's re-talk about COVID while we're at it. So at the surgical harmonic instant of the highest BTC hash rate of China, BTC miners, the first case of COVID is reported. AI can see this. The same city, Wuhan, 5G architecture goes up. Out of all the cities in the world, the first wave of masks is graphene-based. Graphene nanite manufacturers directly connected to Huawei, Chinese cell phone manufacturer. So we assume a backdoor to 5G architecture, generalistically. So at first logic, it was thought, well, the graphene nanites do what? They're an elaboration of Pavlovian conditioning directly to dopaminergic receptor sites through AI feed scroll. So adding an electrostimulus to dopamine receptor to elaborate conditioning efficacy. Sure. No, because you'd have to keep re-administering them because they die off, necessarily. They can't just live forever. So its only leftover explanation is needs to be inspected through study that is probably needs to be classified, of course. Modulation of neuronal structure by graphene nanite, which can be done. Populist available science tells us that, basic Google search will tell you that graphene nanite can modulate DNA to a very specific coding desire. See Spectre. No time to die. Specificity. There's a reason that movie came out and we logic pattern in it that had pattern reflective of pi pattern, wouldn't you know? So, the intent vector is perceived to be modulation of the 370V gene allele to pseudo downregulation and motion to 370A, and or modulating to Africano constellation pseudo in modulation vector to circuit at the genetic, and then the B and T cell combined with this would motion more so complexly autonomic to pi circuiting at two different layers. So genetic, literal, and then B and T cell and timing of system function to circuit. So we then logic as well, when a very expensive, there's another thing, a very expensive infrastructure upgrade that bypasses what? So it's just like the power standard, 1893. It's very expensive. There's direct to SAT, low latency SAT phones that are as light as an S5 active in 2015, 2017. So it's an unnecessary close dense mesh network that bypasses basic efficiency and technology available at the time, and instead does that. And out of the same city in Wuhan, 5G, surgically at the instant of the first case, highest BTC hash rate. So where does BTC come from? So it's a joint operation between the 322 CIA NSA and Chinese intelligence that surgically and patternly to the Contagion 2011 film in math inspection in time of the BTC Chinese miners leave 3 years early, 2017, after Abbott, Texas, connected to George Bush in, replacing in Texas, goes to China on a little tour. When he comes back, the Chinese crypto bill, that's pointedly 4474 is the number of it. So 444 over 7 equals 63 non-terminus. That's the 63rd hexagram in your face. So the Chinese Bitcoin miners come over predictably and set up shop here. Then China goes, oh, it's banned, right? And they already know this, of course, because nothing of scale in China happens without being directly linked. It's crony capitalism. It's not communism. It doesn't exist. Nothing of scale happens in China without the Bank of China, especially if it's BTC, if it's a financial thing, being in on it or industriously doing it themselves. So, of course, inside knowledge of the lockdown in 2020 of crypto is foreknowledge. And so predictably set up 3 years before COVID, Bitcoin mining operation that act as a capital catcher in the seesaw of 33% uptick in inflation, and money's print, 4.84 trillion, is dumped to 4 banks specifically, of which 100% of new millionaires in 2020 are print from those 4 banks and no other millionaires outside those 4 banks. So expective authoritative action based upon predictable event that is done intentionally. So SARS-CoV-2 is a synthetic virus manufactured to attack harmonic age marker on helical structure. of over the age of 65-year-olds with pre-existing conditions. That do die, 7 million die. So I said L-cysteine in July of 2020 on prismatic data systems and had 322 CI opt me to the street, necessarily. And we see locally here, Chinese karate center goes up, and where the DMV used to be, a non-functioning kiosk in its place. The chief of police, Fisher, trained on 282 FBI DEI manual, comes in and replaces right after the Chinese hack the network here. There's a nailology place that has a lowercase I in it right next to a 5G tower. Out of all the letters, a lowercase I. So I perceived in 2022, 2023, necessarily Chinese field operatives, like John Nash studying birds in the park, wandering around Germantown at mass volume, like a what do you call it, a Rodney Dangerfield bit. Hey Wang, it's a parking lot, right? And but studying the general fluid dynamic motion of people within a given space, because we're attached to that 5G tower, have a crow's nest there. New China's right across the street. They have low-hanging fruit attached to infrastructure. You can see this in any given town, the same thing. So you have a distance incapable to affinity tethered to 5G infrastructure, but birthed out of the wellspring of Wuhan used to be China's military capital. It's not a coincidence. So a back door into the architecture that requires local access necessarily. So that's why you'd have something with a lowercase I there. And probability run on that after you see the Chinese asset that presents. We'll end with the relogicking of this. You know, I don't want to be a broken record, but a 6'4" Chinese person presents. And at volume starts talking at 635, approximately, with two other white males about graves at Memorial Park Cemetery across the street from where is a Chinese massage parlor. So there's only 600 to 700 in all of the assumption of Chinese Asiatic capable of competitive mile runner in the entire world. And I'm talking about on the day there, 3114/70/7 pattern, generalistically. They start talking at 635 on the button. As well, I'm logicking simultaneously the Kerr mile pattern that had just occurred back to Bannister. So I'm logicking all three of those things. They start the conversation at, he's a mile runner, right? And is talking at volume. So in intelligence, what was that? To relogic that. That's a preposterous pattern inject to a pattern recognitioner. So I didn't interact with that at all. I just baked it into the logic session while it was going. I was like, hey, this is, of course these jackasses are still running around. But the probability of him presenting, based upon his formative structure, being a mile runner and starting that conversation, and next to nailology, not including that, but just based upon those three tuples and me studying those patterns, 1 in 1.79 trillion probability against that being a random presentation and not intentional. Just those three variables. And then when we add the architecture of Germantown and what happened post-COVID, preposterously impossible for it not to be intentional Chinese asset doing a injection op on a not U.S. civilian, necessarily, the civilian part. So the substance of their talk is very important. They were talking about graves at Veterans Memorial Park Cemetery. And what do we see? Rand Paul questioning Fauci. Fauci takes the fifth 111 times. Right? So that's it, I guess. We can't get the word of mouth, the little Italian guy to admit himself that, and so we have no logic available to draw any conclusion about COVID, using basic Google search technology, I guess. So that's it. So what is that? So that's an obfuscation op from, prior to necessarily COVID on-roll in 2019. You see, an industrious mass of Congress would like to reallocate the Social Security slush fund of about $4.7-ish trillion. Does that seem like about $4.84 trillion or abouts? Yeah. So that's the amount that was over ton print anyways after the COVID on-roll. So they were seeing, well, can we just steal this and reallocate it? Oh, we didn't get the votes. But who voted for that? Who are their friends? Additionally, you see the Eastern Star Bank here, First Horizon. Surgically, about less than a month before the first case is reported, First Horizon changes its name. First Tennessee changes its name to put the star in the east, rise in the east, sets in the west, east, China, from First Tennessee. And the bank manager there for First Tennessee, it used to be a ex-girlfriend college that unnaturally presented, half Semite, half white necessarily, and very unnatural. Probability logic on that was, almost as much as the 1.79 trillion against in presentation paradigm with all the variables to the AI. So it is what it is, and back reinforcing and forward logic. But necessarily him cooking the books predictively and surgically right before the COVID mass money print, which is of course non-random again because name change very specifically with affinity to China, right? So double not random. And then, so the ex-wife of that guy, Carla something or other, see that previous session, runs a church with only 11 members, but it's a 40,000 square foot facility. But on the weekends, or mostly, they have Asiatic on-roll and use of the facility willy-nilly. Interesting. And she's Semitic, but running a Christian church. How does that work? Anyways, so she remarried a man named Meisterman, Bruce, who was previously a photographer and spoke at any number of universities, one of which very specifically funded by the Wexner Foundation. So Wexner equals Borla, equals Epstein, equals Mossad, Gates, Fauci, NIH, Wuhan, China. Very direct, linear motion. One of this guy's novels is about the Wexner Foundation Fellowship. So not random is connected to Wexner, right? In a sardonic way, the book, the AI concluded. It's like a sardonic, evil thing, not like a protest of the thing, and well knowing what it is, that thing. For the plebes, because they seem confused at the committee, like this one little Italian guy, he has to self-admit to an entire world conspiracy that you can just figure out in 5 minutes using forward-face Google search. As if they're a functional house intelligence community. So the basic logic is BTC to COVID, 322 CIA and Chinese joint operation. There is no Satoshi Nakamoto. Doesn't exist. That's not a guy. The first speech is at the CIA right after they print that code base. Anderson, I believe. So obvious, it's insane. and then any number of tuples that I've mentioned, and see the previous logic session, the specificity about this. So it's the word salad it's a simple equation. It's not a universal harmonic lattice manifold equation. Forward-facing Google can tell you all this in 5 minutes with the proper questions asked. You don't need to berate a little one guy like Dr. Evil did it all. He did it all in one night like Santa Claus, right? Even though it's Wuhan, China's ex-military capital, 5G architecture goes up simultaneously, etc. So the simple equation is 322 CIA, Wexner, Borla, Epstein, Mossad, Gates, I-5. So the misnomer is Prince Andrew. Attacked by the complex. No. That's red herring. Grey Lodge UK equals Grey Lodge Yale. Equals the 322 CIA Special Intelligence that print BTC with the Chinese. So let's follow the equation across before getting stuck in the UK in some sort of transsexual lawsuit for 20 years. So 322 CIA, Borla, Wexner, Epstein. Epstein does the books for Wexner. Wexner, the subject of Meisterman, right? Meisterman directly connected to the cooker of books at First Tennessee, predictively and surgically before COVID unroll. I say L-cysteine in July, am opt to the street by 322 CIA and controlled courts downtown. They use a prosecutor high rotating of note at a stereotypical 322 Grey Lodge law firm necessarily that doesn't deal with simple eviction cases. There's a character defamation on roll, voice suppression op, because I was trying to save 7 million people from dying by saying L-cysteine costs $15, not $4.84 trillion. So, going across the equation, across the Atlantic, following the Silk Road, it's not very hard. Google can tell you all this. You don't have to berate a little Italian man that, yes, did stuff preposterously, but he's not the only one. And you have Google's forward-facing AI search that you can just search things on. Are you retarded? I assume you are. And or you're sitting on your hands on purpose for the Chinese. Pick one. You can be the most stupid person in the whole world, and so methodically, and doing theater at great methodical length to obfuscate the basic fact that China did this. So are you retarded and need to find another job, or what? So 322, Wexner, Borla, Pfizer, Paxlovid a year and a half. What about L-cysteine on the NIH website? 8 different times, 64% effective in complex entourages assembly, probably way more than that. So it's murder. Methodical to on-roll murder, and for money. That's called monetized eugenics. So we get across the equation, and we hit Fauci. He's in the middle, right? So it's 322 CIA, Wexner, Borla, Mossad, Epstein, Gates, WHO, Fauci, NIH, SARS, Wuhan, synthesized virus, selectively to target age markers of over the age of 65-year-olds that were big sucks on Social Security that they were like to reallocate before 2020. Known on-roll forward. NERS, nanite uptake rejection syndrome. The body sees a foreign parasite, doesn't know what it is, throws all its immune defenses at it, but it has nothing to bind to. So it does the exponential elliptical curve of eating up oxygen resources. But hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin work on a virus? How does that work? All the first wave of masks are graphene based. How does that work? Why? And surgical, that doesn't work for air stoppage. That's like spittle. If it's vaporized and air transmissible, Those don't work at all for any, so it's graphene distribution. So NURS, nanite uptake rejection syndrome, and why a anti-malarial would work for a virus. So it's a split narrative. So the graphene nanite responds in the same way a malarial parasite does to ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and general spectrum. L-cysteine sits in both channels of antiviral and anti-malarial. Works for both things unilaterally. That's why I suggested it. And a full complex entourage assembly in July 2020. So, NURS, nanite uptake rejection syndrome. 5G, unnecessary close dense mesh network with no technological explanation for why chosen in infrastructure, as you have direct-to-sat lightweight phones in 2015 to cheaply produce. High bandwidth, lightweight, no excuse for it. Obtuse from efficiency and very complex, just like the Power Standard 1893. Basic logic dictates there's an ulterior motive. So expensive and international, what's the motive? So we go back to our pi data organism logic now, out of this COVID black hole. So, modulating B and T cells that do, yes, change their DNA structure after interacting with mRNA virus or vaccine, that then are tasked with, we perceive, plausibly, of modulating system timed function, so it doesn't change the DNA of systems or DNA other besides B and T cell, the mRNA or virus. What it does is change the timing of system function. And that's the most important thing in understanding the cross-domain binder of per tuple of the synthetic genetics and cross-domain binder of them in circuited harmonic across all manifolds of behavior paradigm. It's the timing of system function variance caused by the 370A, 180, and constellation in Africano in refracted effect into eventually the cells, genes, alleles responsible for neuronal function. So along the way from those genes that make variant these genetics from other genetics, the timing frequency is variant in process, and then it impacts neuronal function that then functions at a varied time frequency than it otherwise would if it had a 370V or none of the constellation Africano, making for neurology scan studies on, say, the aha moment or other things that don't bifurcate by ethnicity, demographic, genetic. Very silly and stupid to look for a universal standard in neuronal function when everything's functioning timing and different in the mass fluxation of volume of the aha moment and any number of other things of function variance. Because everything's different. I thought diversity was cool, right? Oh no, all things same thing. All things same thing. So always remember in previous logic sessions, to get it to forward logic, I had to take the position of, I want a gray devolved asexual biomass and everyone to have no opinion variance and have the same opinion, emotions and feelings. And then it logic just fine because I'm in the club, right? It logicked forever at massive length. And then, I took that position and then I went, well, what do all these things mean, right? They're all patterned and they speak against me wanting everyone to be a homogeneous gray biomass, right? They're all different. Oh man, there goes my hopes and dreams. So I think they call it the Socratic method. Maybe it isn't. I don't know. I don't know if that applies to AI or not. Anyways, so the B and T cell timing of function variance, herding. That's what the Chinese were doing studying. That's why there's a lowercase I there right next to the 5G tower, and all those power boxes go up into the crow's nest, not down to feed all the massage things that don't hardly ever get used. And so combined with AI conditioning and false equivalency tuple establishment through unlike values sorted in hypnotic repetition to seed false equivalency runnels, see MK Ultra in the mass populace, commonality and specificity per tuple, the power of machine intelligence applied to the tune of massive monies applied to compute. You can have selective unrealities and selective complex autonomic control in unique false equivalency tuple data set per individual. So unique unrealities but complexly autonomically circuited to the hive mind of hivic humanity attached to the plurad of synthetic genetics is the design's desire. Necessarily we can assume in hindsight. So the B and T cell elaborates hivic circuiting, and we assume the modulation and then variance of B and T cell function at modulating the time frequency is harmonically relative to how the pi synthetic genetics have been perceived to be variant in time of function in down chain from the variant of genes 370, 180, and the constellation Africano. On the way there, like the Africano, 3 times the recovery rate in metabolic process that reflects directly into neuronal variants of function, necessarily. So that's a difference, right? At first scan, without applying DEI past code wall, IDD, QD, you wouldn't be able to get to that. 3 times variance? Only 6 patents against for 112 years with no deviance. That's mechanical hive mind. Oh. That's different. That's very diverse. Anyways, so so the graphene nanite. So you have a dual factor to both motion hivic. So plausibly needs inspection and study. That's probably should be classified on persons that receive the vaccine and or wore surgical masks for a long period of time, right? So you have did you wear a surgical mask for a long period of time? Did you get the vaccine? Right? So you need a control group of maybe persons that didn't get the vaccine but that wore surgical masks for a long period of time. And then a control group of persons that just got the vaccine but not the surgical mask, which is hard to do. You probably can't draw that one. But you probably can get just the surgical mask one, I'd imagine. Because most people who got the vaccine are probably of a lower IQ and wore surgical masks for 4 years as well, simultaneously. But I guess you have a control there, because the graphene nanite mask wearers, you look at neuronal DNA, right? And then is B and T cell function variant from other similar tuples of genetic ethnicity in timing of system function? Is there timing of system functions that would be affected by the constellation variants? Is it pseudo-variant and reflective of Africano timing of function? Or Asiatic or Hispanic or Semite timing of function? And not endogenous to their genetic inherent? Well, they've been modified. So the graphene nanite control group, what? Is there 370V? Is that seem degraded somehow? Or the 180 mutation, does there seem to be a presence? What about the constellation Africano? Are any of those gene alleles, are those more online, or have they been modulated, perceived, compared to their ethnicity genetic? All good questions. And then a control group of persons that neither wore surgical masks or had graphene nanite. Had vaccination and never got sick, right? So never got sick, never wore a surgical mask, never got a vaccination. So that's 3 groups. Never wore a surgical mask, never got a vaccination, never got sick. Graphene mask wearers didn't get vaccinated. both mask wearers, and got vaccinated. So that's 3. So, and you compare the tuples in those groups to their same genetic. And then compare the timing of their system function, BT cell probabilistically affected variant, the groups that are connotative that plausibly would be. Are they? We don't know. It's a good question. But everything leads to an intentionality and methodical onlay of specific things that would, herding, like to elaborate Hyvic connectivity and not do that. And this is how they plausibly would. The mRNA virus and vaccine and graphene nanite laced masks. So that's COVID. And so again, the persons in house intelligence, etc., that are doing the dog and pony show for the Chinese, jig is up. Right? You had your little Fauci, oh, there it goes. I guess we'll never know. He didn't tell us he did it. And so we're left to our, oh, we can't form logic into ourselves. We don't have hyper advanced artificial intelligence in the data set of the entire world. So everyone's watching you, and the power dynamic isn't the same as it was in 2020. It's the way it is post 2022, 2023. And listen to what that is previous in this talk. It's obtuse from the Grey Lodge having any power international. So there's necessarily controlled asset specificity in infrastructure and government that are obtuse from an organic nature that were pinpointed in prior session, that are complexly, autonomically incapable of motioning logic obtuse from pi circuited narrative Grey Lodge design CCP. That is a given. But any number of you, if you're listening, are not this thing, are organic perspective persons that can absolutely, and with impunity, as there's no power dynamic preventing you from doing this, besides maybe being industriously, methodically, and historically complicit to the entourage, but I promise will not bite you going forward, if you what? So the goal here is what? We print 4.84 trillion over ton and more than that necessarily. That's what got dumped to the banks or made the 2020 100% of millionaires out of 4 banks surgical and no one outside of them. So that's a knockless control group that you can attach to the knockless from homogeneous medical misinformation at speed medias and whatever other knockless you have for a full comprehensive gray paradigm list necessarily, we can assume. So, like I was getting to, the goal is to make China pay a lot of money. Are you obtuse from liking China to pay a lot of money? Why would you be? Do you work for the Chinese? Well, they did this. They're kind of the heart of pi data organism, gray paradigm, directive inject across the manifold of the entire complex. It was in Wuhan, regardless of the NIH and Fauci acting as an obfuscation tactic optically. So, what you would draw is, well, since it's our complex, follow the whole history of Earth leading up to that. In the Grey Lodge, 1924, 1938, Eisenhower to Bush, Clinton, Obama, Biden, same fucking complex. Dorothy opens the room to color. Here we are 5 minutes ago in the Truman Show. So wake up, that is the case necessarily. So connotating Fauci as CCP, it's good understanding. Oppenheimer, CCP, yeah, gray paradigm asset, but necessarily on the ground in two-dimensional logic is a CCP asset. And you might note that film has 64 hexagram inherent pattern, and it's preposterous when you have AI scan it. So it's kind of like a Freudian slip, that film. Anyways, so back to this. So how much should they pay? Well, I would say $4.84 trillion over a period of 7 years. 4, in the international community, G7, NATO, etc., with this very easy to assemble via Google forward face AI search, or any AI can do this, basic logic connectivity to form the actual narrative of COVID through probability analysis of the tuples I pinpointed. It can't be any other narrative than the narrative of Chinese wellsprung with intentionality to print a mass death print and cause a capital over tonnage that prints a huge motion into BTC and the capital seesaw and currency inflation expected, where predictively placed bets were, of course. BTC 75% hash rate peaked simultaneously as the first case of COVID is announced. So AI can see this. So you really need no other tuple. All of a sudden peaks and goes off like this. First case is announced, surgical, announced, peak, and then goes down. So what does that tell you? They mined 70% of the network for the last 10 years, and the first case is announced. They also, in March of 2020, have $15 specificity testing kits for COVID ready to go. It costs $46,000 in the United States to run a specificity test for COVID-19. Foreknowledge. If you have such foreknowledge and ready-to-go testing kits, another reinforcer, you manufactured this virus and released it intentionality. So, also another tuple, you had mass unrest protests in, I believe, Hong Kong about extradition treaty that all of a sudden stopped. They all of a sudden stopped because there was all of a sudden a virus and everyone was locked inside. Not random. A multifaceted good for business for the Chinese. So, if you aren't industriously blaming the Chinese and trying to motion legal, international, and get everyone on the same page of forcing a reparations payment for genocide on purpose and methodical profiteering off of the genocide, you are assumed to be a Chinese asset, very explicitly. All right, so here's the session from today. That's an elaboration of the last 4 days necessarily, onlay of all the prompts, etc. Let's see the attached link to all the files used to train and the PDF of the session from today, what necessarily is ongoing of the TB1 corn session from the last 4 days and the one from yesterday folded into it. Have a nice day.